Hi, and welcome to DFMDC's podcast around connecting networks for greater opportunity. My name is Jeff Herle. I am the VP of Operations with DFM Data Corp. And we have Mark Montague and Dr. Vic Uzumeri. Mark, do you want to take just a second to introduce yourself?
Good morning or afternoon. I'm an analyst for DFM. And I also have 38 years of industry experience, the latest with a leading load board, but I've also worked on the supply chains of many companies throughout the United States and Canada.
And Vic?
I'm Vic Uzumeri. I'm a recovering academic, but I also have a lot of quite diverse industry experience and a long-term interest in how systems work and what it takes to make business systems and logistics systems function.
Very good. In my background in supply chain is 22 years with the Coca-Cola system, building out supply chains, distribution, transportation, and then doing some B2B marketing on the back end of that. So we look forward to an engaging presentation today and talking through how expanding networks creates greater opportunity for not only the individual DFMs, but also the industry in total. So this is part of a continuing set of podcasts to help bridge from the previous podcasts. We thought we'd go back and just talk a little bit about the TUID, or Transport Unit ID. And Vic, do you want to talk us through this first slide?
Well, sure. Thanks, Jeff. If we take a look at the cycle, I mean, the life cycle, I guess, of a shipment, there's a great deal of interest and focus on standardizing, automating, creating auditing, tracking, tracing, all the rest of the stuff in what is effectively the transport phase of that's when, once the carrier has actually been booked, once the load's there, the truck's at the door. From that moment on, there's a lot of information collected, a lot recorded, and a lot managed. And which means that every one of them has every load has a unique ID once it goes onto the carrier. The problem is that the industry doesn't start there. I mean, the activity begins at least a couple of steps earlier when the shipper is trying to solicit a carrier for the load. And they may be approaching brokers. As I pointed out here, the load identifiers are clearly defined at the start of the transport phase. What we need are load identifiers that are defined at the start of the search and negotiation phase, because a lot of critical decisions that affect the cost and the timing of the load are actually made during the search and negotiate. By the time the truck's at the door, you know what's going to happen. Unless something bad happens, it's very predictable. There's not much that you can do to change the cost. So we're looking at the idea of creating an identifier for loads at least two steps earlier in the shipping process that can follow all the way through and which can capture the activities and behaviors in that critical search and negotiation phase.
Very good. And Mark, have you recognized this issue as well in the past?
Yeah, when I worked for the load board company, one of the big issues was inflation in load-to-truck ratios, and that meant that it was earlier in the shipment process. It was kind of searching for the carrier. That step resulted in bad metrics. You had some kind of indicator that there was higher demand when the number went up, but you didn't have an absolute trust in the number. And that meant that you didn't have the visibility or the predictability that you liked from that metric. And also, when it actually came to pickup, there was often a lot of confusion. Even today, there's a lot of truck order not used, a lot of carrier no-shows, and a lot of that is confusion in the identification of loads.
Very good. And one of the things that we've done to update this and better match it against statuses that we'll talk about later is introduce some more industry recognized language. So decision to source, typically those loads are on hold. Then once the decision to ship happens, it's posted. Once a carrier is solicited, it's pre-booked. The carrier responds, there's a rate confirmation created. When the carrier actually books and the load is built and it's booked, then it's en route. Once it hits the geofence and is delivered, and then invoiced. So those are, again, a little more recognized within the industry itself and help populate the statuses that we've created and we'll talk about a little bit later. Here are a couple of links for the audience to go back to the previous TUID podcasts in case you didn't view them in the past.
I should point out that those links go to sessions where we actually define some of the technical details of how a transport unit identifier or TUID can be created and how it can be managed. But those are details we didn't want to cover in this particular podcast.
Great. Thanks for the clarification, Vic. So as we take a look at businesses' motivation to change, they really want to change either for one of two reasons. Either they want to make more top line revenue or they want to spend less, right? Either of those drive more profit. And that motivation and looking at our solutions, the first against the spending less was cleaning phantom data, which save time, money, and yield better decisions by cleaning up some of that phantom data that's out there. And then the second solution we'll talk a little bit more about today is the opportunity to, again, with the pipelines that we want to put in place to be able to co-broker and extend brokers' networks and make them more money at the end of the day when the capacity of their trucking network, their truck network or carrier network just can't cover a load. So both are obviously very complex. This is the architecture for the proposed solution around cleansing phantom data. You can see on the left, we've got shipper, carrier, and receiver, as well as 3 different DFMs, digital freight matching brokers. So a shipper potentially sends out a notification, I want to ship a load to 2 different brokers. At the same time, a carrier has posted, I've got availability to 2 separate DFM brokers. The networks don't match. The DFM1 is able to, because they've got the carrier as well as the load notification, can consummate that transaction. They send that transaction to a virtual machine, the anonymized transaction relay, which connects to a data ingestion service. That data ingestion service can then send notification back out to the other DFMs, cleansing the information. This truck, as well as this load, are covered. And then based on that, you say, yes, I've cleaned out a load, and which communicates back to the virtual machine, and again, back to the data ingestion service. So they're able to figure out exactly what we're able to clean in terms of the phantom data within DFM's databases. Vic, do you have any other comments on top of that?
Not really. The key point is that there are a lot of references out there, some of which are easy to track down, some are really hard, and some are probably impossible. And the key is to create a system which will get rid of most or all of those duplicate once it's booked, they're obsolete and spurious. So we want to get those off of our system so people aren't wasting their time and energy chasing down things that no longer exist.
Right. There's time, there's phone calls, there's emails back and forth, trying to figure out, you know.
And there's
Right.
and there's a potential for lost capacity. So while you're chasing something else, you're missing something you really should get.
Right.
I mean, there's just so many small niggling losses and costs in a system where there are anonymous, untraceable, uncleanable loads wandering around the national logistics framework.
Right. Right. Mark, any insights here?
Yeah, I'd like to talk to that on a practical basis. In today's marketplace, say a owner operator or small carrier can typically expect to earn somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 to $1,200 a day or even higher. If they get bad information, if they commit to a load that has already been covered, they show up at the shipper's dock, find out the load's gone. By the time they get back in the system to look for another load, they may have lost an entire day's worth of revenue. So that's bad for the carrier industry. But the impact nationwide is something like on the order of 10% of capacity could be lost between bad information, excessive delays, rebooking of that, plus the loss of trust that exists in the industry. There's friction between brokers and carriers, and that translates up to the ladder between shippers and brokers and shippers and carriers as well.
And with the lack of trucking capacity in the market today, that 10% is a huge number.
Yes, it's not only a time, but it's also a tremendous amount of, well, just everything just costs more. It's part of the inflationary trend in trucking that we've seen over the past year, because there has been there was disruption in 17 and 18, and now we're certainly experiencing it again with the storms, the continued disruption throughout the country with the pandemic. It's really reached a painful point.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to that second part of the solution. And that is, first we wanted to address co-brokering versus double brokering. So double brokering, the original broker does not know who's handling the freight, whether the actual carrier has permits, insurance, and if there was any due diligence in qualifying that carrier. So definitely something to be eliminated from the industry. Co-brokering, though, creates opportunity where you're aware of each other, you've identified each other, you've permissioned each other, you have a preference for the folks you're interacting with. And so it's a known network where you can expand beyond your carrier network to fulfill additional loads, helping both you as well as the other broker, so that you're not missing that load and not able to fulfill against your customers' needs. And Vic, I think you have an example.
I have an example of that.
So
Mark will follow up and give an even more specific industry example, I'm sure. But what I want to do is share my screen and show an example that I think most people, certainly in the business community, are pretty familiar with. And that's booking an airline. And I've got a flight here that just randomly is Toronto to Barcelona in January 12, 2022. And the thing that's really interesting here, everybody's familiar with it, is this line that says multiple airlines. What we have here is a flight involving WestJet going to Gatwick, followed by Vueling Airlines. I'd never heard of Vueling Airlines. But nonetheless, apparently they fly between Gatwick and Barcelona. And there's a flight that's bookable. The requirements, the question that this raises with co-brokering is, can we envision or imagine a future sometime ahead where a shipper would be able to pick out of a list the same kind of choices and opportunities that we take for granted as an airline passenger. And one requirement that is absolutely critical to that you can't do it at all without it, is that we know that it's the same passenger going on every one of these legs. We're handing off one passenger from one airline to another, and that's tracked and knowable because that passenger is identified. We can't do that, as I understand, best I can figure out, we can't do that because we don't identify the loads to the same level of specificity. Mark, do you want to disagree or expand, whatever?
Well, one thing with the airline industry is that you have the same airlines running the same routes. So at least there's that kind of uniformity. In the trucking industry, there are over 200,000 for hire motor carriers in North America. Mostly a US-based carrier can go anywhere in the lower 48 states. And what that means is that there's a level of complexity that even exceeds the airline industry as far as the problem solving. To know where these trucks are, which ones are available, to be able to book them, all is an order of magnitude higher, and that just means that there's a greater need for collaboration because of the level of fragmentation that you have.
If we were to establish a common system of identifying the loads, so that these things, these little the pearls on the necklace could be tied together. I mean, what you're saying is it's going to take us. It's a bigger lift, and it'll take longer, maybe quite a while, to get to where the airline industries are. But we're not going to move in that direction effectively until we have a handle on the identification of the loads that can be used industry-wide. Is that a fair statement?
That is the absolute core of all of this. And once you have the load identified, now you've got a common language that both the carrier and the shipper of the freight, as they pass through, brokerages, different systems that they can speak to, and that'll greatly move us towards a seamless end-to-end system. There's more probably to take out in the freight industry than there is in the airline industry, but we know from what I've heard you talk about the airline industry, it was a tremendous advantage and took out a lot of inefficiencies there. And I look forward to seeing what it could do for the transport industry in North America.
So the trucking industry's journey may be a little longer and a little more arduous, but it's got to go in roughly the same direction.
Absolutely.
And Vic, from your understanding, how was that? What was the primary driver of that? Was it the industry itself? Was it regulatory bodies?
I've heard different stories about it, so I don't want to profess to know a definitive answer. But I think in that particular industry, there were a lot of big players who were heavyweights who got behind it. The government recognized its importance. So I think what amounted to is, and one of the things about the airline industry is they have some big players who, when they do agree to do something, carry a tremendous amount of clout. It's harder to do that in the trucking industry where it's much more fragmented, especially at the carrier level. So I think clout, and the clout came from several sources. I'm going to stop sharing, get back to your.
Okay.
I will say the airline industry ended up doing a lot of this through what are in fact companies that they constructed, which have ownership by many of the airlines. So they're sort of almost massive joint venture companies to make a lot of this stuff happen, which gave it a certain amount of, made it easier in some ways for for major companies to participate, because they had a stake and they had a say, and they had
And some operating rules and governance.
yeah, all that stuff that everybody knows. Everybody in industry knows how to set up a company and how to make it run. So it was sort of a convenient method. That's something we suggest the trucking industry should probably consider and look at.
Very good. So moving along, the current cloud marketplace allows for load identification, shipper sending information to the marketplace, interested carriers seeing that information, a specific carrier says, yes, I'll take that load. It's confirmed with the shipper and or broker, and then is delivered. Now, one of the opportunities for co-brokering is in that same case, shipper sends information to a broker relative to a transport order. Unfortunately, their carrier network can't handle that order. But a co-broker has the capacity, has the trucking capacity, and a contract carrier who's interested in that load, again, via the information that's used between the two, the permission network, the known network, they can contract and the load can be delivered. But all of that is a prerequisite of all of that is creating that known network, as well as the status and information that's passed back and forth between broker, co-broker, shipper, receiver, and carrier. Now, there's also the identity influence within the cloud network as well. Vic, do you want to speak to a little bit of this?
Well, the very first slide we showed had just a single cloud, and we probably all are familiar with using things like eBay, Airbnb, Lyft, and Uber, and so on. Those are basically one cloud marketplaces, or one marketplace clouds, or whatever. But with a much more fragmented, so many different brokers. Over 10,000. So many DFMs. I don't know what our current number is, but it's in the hundreds. All of them creating their own little mini cloud. It's very easy for information to get passed around. A marketplace may actually work with another marketplace and put information there, but it's also easy for information to get lost. That was back to that phantom data problem, and this is where it gets created. One broker shares with another broker. That's the big colored line. That other broker may, unknown to everybody else, may share with a third broker. There's nothing to stop them. And so we have a proliferation of information. It's really the same load, but it's proliferating in various levels of detail across possibly multiple clouds. And there are actually some software companies out there who make it a business to scrape information off one cloud and make it available on another to further complicate the world. So the idea behind what we're talking about is that if we sort of go to the next slide. Oh, there's my last one. Okay. We go to the next slide. We can look at the same thing if the shipper had a TUID that was defined before they started sending their information out to the various clouds. And if the second requirement, if the various participants in the system passed that information along, if they simply provided that ID to whoever they were talking to, and the ID followed it around the system, then we would have a complete, it'd be hard work, but we could back into and work out everybody who's there. So the idea is to get one single identifier created at the point where the shipment is conceived and defined, and have it simply attach. It's the label that goes with that shipment, that load, throughout the system for as far as that system will take it. And then we can back out anything that we don't like about the records that are left.
And it's something everybody is looking for. So not only does the shipper send it, but the broker's looking for it, the carrier's looking for it, the receiver's looking for it. So it becomes, the common language amongst all of those.
But if these loads that are listed on all these different clouds, if we can't tie them back to the origin, they become, that's phantom, but that becomes incredibly confusing to the industry. And it's a pretty simple solution to make it go away.
Right. Mark, what do you think?
It just reminds me of how easy it is to get things mixed up. Say there's 2 truckloads to be picked up. One driver has an 11 a.m. appointment and another driver has a 1 a.m. appointment. Somehow the guy with the 1 o'clock appointment arrives before the other driver gets his load. So the second driver arrives, his load's already gone. So they assign him to the second load, which isn't ready. And he ends up waiting hours at the dock. Completely unavoidable if you have that TUID, if you have that unique to it, and people understand how to use it. That this is kind of thing that happens on shipping docks throughout North America, thousands of times every day. We're dealing with the freight marketplace, and not only truckload shipments, intermodal shipments, LTL shipments. I imagine that there's a much wider range of shipments in the $700 billion North American freight industry out there.
Yeah, and all of that, not only from a practical standpoint, gets in the way of actually getting things shipped, but it also impacts the decision making by having all of those, extra data points sitting out there that you think, all of these loads are booked, all of these loads are posted and tendered. And in fact, they're not, because there's so many duplications out there.
Yep.
So as we take a look at the ways to extend the information that help the TUID become really effective, originally DFMDC came up with these 6 statuses that would help eliminate the phantom data. So passing information back and forth for a shipment that was booked, booking confirmation status, when the actual goods were en route, when they were getting status updates from ELD or GPS, and then when they tripped the geofence, en route arrived, and then when the receipt was actually processed digital.
If you had a TUID to it, every single one of those events that occurred at different places, different times, and maybe involving different people would all be strung together like a string of pearls.
Right. I mean, it's a chronological set of events, right? Just like we saw in that original slide that we had.
Which by itself would create a quality check on the record keeping.
And history, right?
Yep.
You're building a history of that and of that load cycle.
And the analysts would be happy.
Well, yeah, they could do a lot more. Their forecasts and such would be a lot more accurate. The next kind of iteration that we went through was thinking about then the co-brokering opportunity, and we expanded the number of statuses we were thinking about including in this model to handle that co-brokering opportunity. Because if you take a look at the first one, even though the receipt was processed digitally, you want to make sure the goods are delivered in good order on the back end, as well as seeing some of the front end activity for the posting. So posting now, if a tender was rejected, any pre-booking carrier package. So we've expanded it to handle all the steps required for co-brokering. What we really want to do, and part of the reason for this podcast series, is engage the leadership of the industry. Coming up with what are the specific steps as well as elements that are required to pass information back and forth. So we have known loads, we have known carrier capacity. We can run a lot more efficiently. You can make more money either by revenue increase from co-brokering or from more efficient operation, not calling on loads that were already booked from an efficiency standpoint. But it's going to require leadership and people joining the conversation in terms of really defining what's needed, both from a status standpoint, as well as what data elements are required to nail that down. Some of the work that's been done already and relates back, we've got 81 statuses already identified, as well as 56 data elements identified. And we completed that work, but we know that there probably are some exceptions that are not included that should be. And we want, again, is leadership of the industry to come together, join the conversation. Let's get to a consensus around what makes sense from both the status standpoint, as well as what data elements are we going to pass back and forth. Again, as we talked about earlier, anonymized so that you can't tell customer, you're not sharing customer information, you are sharing shipment information, but making sure that it's hashed so that people aren't getting each other's customers. But all of this is just a start.
All of these events that occur in just one normal shipment cycle, the challenge is to bring together data from multiple companies, because everybody's got a piece of the puzzle. And if we had a TUID, which, as you say, was anonymized, basically technique is run it through a hash, but there could be other methods. If it's anonymous, then we can assemble data from many, many companies, do all kinds of interesting analysis without actually knowing which company did what. And therefore, we're not getting into their competitive information, but we can see how the industry works. The opportunities for big data, for analysis at an industry level for everyone's benefit would be tremendous. Now, there's a lot of mechanics to work out to get there, but having the TUID would be the first essential step in the process.
Right. And Mark, from your end, think about the analytical work potentially that you could do, against that, huge data set.
Yeah, in my 30-year career, when I did analysis, 95% of it was cleaning up the data to make it usable. So this would be a tremendous boost. Data was impossible to use without a common identifier, so you didn't miscount shipments. But even once that was established, there was a need for standards of what elements are present in that data set, so that you could mix the different shippers' data together to look at that larger picture and stuff. I think the benefits, Vic is absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of benefits that can be derived in the metadata from looking at how shipment data behaves together. And I would really love to be an analyst
love to
for
get your hands on
10
it.
years. If I could have access to that kind of stuff.
Well, and that's something, that's an opportunity for the industry really to come together to be able to, share that information from a macro standpoint. And then potentially you could even carve off pieces of it where they can, get some of that individually, that has more of a focus around their their lanes, their customers, their shipping destinations. It again just creates all kinds of opportunities. The status updates that we've shown here, or statuses 10 through 99, again, are just some of the high points that we've selected out. There are, again, a number of statuses that we haven't shown in this. Again, in total, there are 81 of them, but a lot of them have to do with exceptions along the process. And again, we don't think it, we aren't proud enough to say, this is the comprehensive list. Again, we want to engage in conversation across the industry to be able to, more completely fill that out, as well as, talk about and agree upon what are the priority statuses that we want to start with, and how do we get this going. And now we also have a governance model that's available, as well as platform established to be able to, drive this. It starts off with member companies, members of DFMDC. They will elect a steering committee. They're of equity members. There'll also be some invited participants of that steering committee, but the majority of the members will be equity members of the DFM network. But the invited participants will be people out of standards bodies, academia, as well as one participant from DFM Data Corp. But they will be the elected body that decides, yay or nay against any of the statuses or any of the opportunities to either increase the amount of statuses that we collect or increase the number of data elements, again, depending upon what outcome we're looking for. Member companies will also contribute people to the working groups. So as ideas come forth from the members or participants, working groups will take them and evaluate them for fit. Is this part of the mission? Does it make money? Are there any risks associated with it? And then the working group would then push it off or send the recommendation to the steering committee. The steering committee then votes on it and says, yes, we want to move forward with it. Please go execute it. And that'll go off to the operating company, DFM Data Corp. Or it could say, it's a great idea, not yet. Something else is in front of it. Or again, this isn't part of the mission. We're going to table this one. But the steering committee runs it, and will be, only makes sense from a, freight, establishing freight consensus, if you will, or consensus opinions. So what we're asking for, the call to action here is, we'd like you to help, lead the industry to better outcomes. Come join the conversation at, dfmdata.com/join. Make your voice heard, become part of the solution, engage with your peers. We want to set not only standards, but also the glossary, how we're defining each of these statuses and data elements, as well as participate by, offering up, here's some of the opportunities that we see. Here's some of the initiatives we think the industry should go ahead and undertake, because it's part of the common set of problems. And, at the end of the day, then transform the freight marketplace. Move it forward, get it more coordinated, and again, have better outcomes for not only the individual participants, but also customers overall. So it looks as if we have a question from the audience, and it's around who generates the TUID. Vic, do you want to handle that?
Sure. First answer is the TUID is created from a recipe. The idea is, and part of what the governance is to define and make sure that everybody agrees with the recipe. Once you have the recipe, it can be generated by the shipper unilaterally. They don't need anyone else to generate the TUID if they follow the rules. At the same time, DFM Data Corp is actively working to build an online cloud service, which will be a TUID generator that anyone can use. So there's a number of ways that I would expect that if we agree on the recipe, they can be baking the bread in a whole lot of different places, in several different ways. But we're certainly going to be providing a service so that people who don't want to get into the bakery business can grab it whenever they need one.
Good. Bread delivered.
Yep.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for that answer, Vic, and thanks for the question from the audience. So Vic or Mark, any closing comments?
I think the key thing here is that this is a very fragmented industry. It's going to take probably in a different form than the airlines accomplish their goal, but it's going to take some heavyweight participants to get behind the idea, then ultimately probably take control of it through the governance system to make it what the industry itself wants it to be. So this is really, I mean, we've taken some care to create a detailed conversation starter, but there's a lot more conversation required and a lot more people, especially people with big stakes in the industry, to participate as well.
Right. Yeah, DFM Data Corp is set up as a neutral utility for use of the industry. It is not the driver of that conversation. So, how about you, Mark? Anything to add?
Yeah, I had a conversation with a pretty large 3PL about their data. And what came out of that was they said that they didn't realize how much they were missing by having errors in their data, by having a lack of standardization in their data. And once that was put in place, it became a lot more meaningful to them for internal use. So this is really a win-win opportunity, across the industry, but also internally for best practices.
Very good. Well, with that, thank you very much for your attendance at the and Vic and Mark for your insights during this presentation. Again, come join us in the conversation at dfmdata.com/join. We look for your participation.